My name is Elena Rodriguez. I'm 38 years old, and I've been living on borrowed time since an IED exploded 15 feet from my convoy in Iraq 7 years ago. The doctors said I was lucky to keep both legs. I call it Wednesday. Some days, the pins in my left femur remind me why I wake up grateful. Other days, like today, they remind me why I trusted the wrong person with everything I had earned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Standard government envelope, return address from the Department of Veterans Affairs. I almost didn't open it. After 6 years of appeals, denials, and medical reviews, most VA correspondence felt like paper cuts delivered through the mail slot. But this one was different, thicker, official in a way that made my coffee taste bitter before I even broke the seal. Inside was a notice of investigation, fraudulent benefit claims, potential criminal charges, my name at the top, followed by case numbers I'd never seen before. My hands started shaking, not from the nerve damage this time, but from something colder. The letter mentioned duplicate claims, false documentation, and benefits paid to unauthorized recipients. At the bottom, in bold letters that seemed to pulse with accusation, it said investigation pending for Elena M. Rodriguez, claim numbers spanning 3 years. I read it twice. Then I called the number listed, fingers fumbling over the keypad. The voice that answered was professional, detached, like she'd delivered bad news 1,000 times before. She confirmed what the letter implied. Someone had been filing benefit claims in my name. Someone with access to my medical records, my service documentation, my social security number. Someone who knew exactly which boxes to check to make the system pay out. The investigation had started 6 months ago when a computer audit flagged unusual patterns. Multiple addresses for the same claimant. Benefit payments redirected to accounts I'd never opened. Medical appointments I'd never attended, yet somehow billed to my file. The agent's voice grew sharper when she mentioned the total amount, $47,000 over 18 months. Money I'd never seen, benefits I'd never received, all flowing somewhere else while I scraped by on my actual disability payments. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for an hour, staring at the cracked linoleum floor. The morning light shifted across the table, highlighting dust motes that danced like static. My mind kept cycling through the same question. Who would do this? Who could do this? The answer was sitting in a framed photo on my refrigerator, smiling back at me with perfect teeth and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to earn anything. My sister Jessica had always been the smart one, valedictorian in high school while I barely graduated, full scholarship to college while I joined the Army because I couldn't afford tuition. She became a medical administrative specialist at a veterans hospital in Phoenix, climbing the ladder with the same methodical precision she'd used to organize our childhood closets. She understood the system better than anyone. She knew exactly how the benefits flowed, which departments talked to each other, and which ones didn't. When I came home from Iraq, leg held together with titanium and hope, Jessica had been the one to help me navigate the VA bureaucracy. She'd driven me to appointments, helped me fill out forms, explained the difference between disability ratings and compensation schedules. She'd been patient when I couldn't focus, when the medications made me forget conversations we'd had an hour earlier. She'd taken power of attorney for medical decisions when I was too overwhelmed to make them myself. I trusted her because she was family, because she understood the military culture in a way my parents never could, because she'd held my hand through the darkest months when I wasn't sure I wanted to keep fighting for benefits that felt impossible to obtain. She'd been my advocate, my translator, my bridge between the world I'd left behind in the desert and the one I was struggling to rebuild. The irony cut deeper than any shrapnel ever had. The person who'd helped me claim the benefits I'd earned was the same person who'd been stealing them. While I'd been living in a studio apartment, counting pills and avoiding social situations that triggered flashbacks, she'd been building something else entirely, something I was about to discover had been funded with my sacrifice. I drove to Phoenix that afternoon. The trip took 3 hours, long enough for anger to cycle through disbelief and back again. Jessica's neighborhood sat on the north side of the city, where the houses had 3-car garages and homeowners associations that regulated lawn height. Her address led me to a Mediterranean-style home with palm trees lining the circular driveway and a fountain in the front courtyard. The kind of place that belonged in magazines, not in the budget of a hospital administrator. The BMW in the driveway was new. The landscaping was professionally maintained. Everything looked perfect, pristine, paid for. I sat in my dented Honda for 20 minutes, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew about Jessica's salary. Hospital administration paid well, but not this well. Not pool in the backyard, marble countertops, luxury sedan well. When she opened the front door, her face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. Surprise, then recognition, then something that might have been fear before settling into the practiced smile she'd perfected over years of managing difficult patients and demanding doctors. She was wearing yoga pants that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a tank top that showed off arms that had never carried anything heavier than medical files. She invited me in with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Vaulted ceilings, hardwood floors that gleamed under recessed lighting, furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. Everything smelled like vanilla and money, a combination that made my stomach turn. We sat in her living room on a cream-colored sofa that probably cost more than my car, and I pulled out the letter. Her face changed as she read it, the color draining from her cheeks in a way that confirmed what I'd already suspected. She didn't ask what it meant. She didn't express confusion or outrage on my behalf. She just folded the letter carefully and set it on the glass coffee table between us like it was evidence she was trying not to contaminate. The silence stretched between us, thick with years of carefully maintained deception. I waited for her to explain, to deny, to show some sign of the sister who'd driven me to medical appointments and helped me understand why my leg would never be the same. Instead, she looked at me with the same professional detachment I'd heard in the VA investigator's voice. She told me it had started small, a billing error that went unnoticed, a duplicate payment that should have been caught but wasn't. She'd meant to report it, she said, but then she'd seen how easy it was to manipulate the system. How many veterans fell through the cracks? How much money got lost in administrative shuffles? She'd convinced herself she was just correcting inefficiencies, redirecting benefits that would have been wasted on bureaucratic overhead. The rationalization was so polished I could tell she'd been practicing it. Maybe she'd even convinced herself it was true. But as she spoke, her eyes kept drifting to the expensive art on the walls, the designer furniture, the lifestyle that had been built on my pain. This wasn't about correcting inefficiencies. This was about opportunity and entitlement, and the kind of quiet greed that wears a helpful smile. What I didn't know, as I sat in that perfect living room listening to my sister explain how she'd stolen my benefits, was that someone else had been watching. Someone with a badge and the authority to turn her perfect world into evidence. Someone who'd been building a case that would make her fountain and her BMW and her marble countertops look very different under the harsh light of a federal investigation. The raid was still 3 weeks away, but the foundation had already started cracking. Agent Marcus Chen looked like he'd stepped out of a procedural drama, navy suit pressed to perfection, badge clipped to his belt with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He sat across from me in the VA building's conference room, a recorder between us on the scratched table, and explained how white-collar crime worked in the digital age. Every transaction left fingerprints. Every falsified document created a trail. Every lie told to a federal agency became evidence in a folder that kept getting thicker. Jessica wasn't the first family member to exploit a veteran's benefits, and she wouldn't be the last. But she'd made the mistake of getting too comfortable, too greedy, too confident in her understanding of the system she'd been gaming for almost 2 years. The red flags had started accumulating months ago. Duplicate Social Security numbers generating claims from different addresses. Medical appointments scheduled simultaneously in cities hundreds of miles apart. Bank deposits that didn't match the payment authorizations. Chen spread the evidence across the table like he was dealing cards. Bank statements showing deposits of exactly $1,247 every month, the amount of my disability compensation flowing into an account Jessica had opened using my information but her address. Medical reports for treatments I'd never received, signed by doctors I'd never met, all processed through the Phoenix VA where she worked. Purchase orders for medical equipment that had been shipped to her home address but billed to my veteran file number. The sophistication of the fraud impressed even the investigators. Jessica had created a shadow version of my benefits file, complete with forged medical records that justified increased compensation. She'd scheduled phantom appointments with specialists, submitted falsified treatment reports, and even created fictional therapy sessions for PTSD that I'd never been diagnosed with. Every month, while I struggled to pay rent on my actual disability payments, she'd been collecting a parallel stream of benefits that painted me as far more disabled than I actually was. The most damaging evidence sat in a manila folder Chen handled like it contained explosives. Screenshots from Jessica's computer, recovered through a warrant I didn't know had been issued, internal VA emails where she'd discussed my case with colleagues, always professionally, always helpfully, while simultaneously mining my file for information she could use to expand the fraud. She'd been playing both sides, the concerned sister helping her veteran sibling navigate bureaucracy, and the calculating thief methodically stripping away benefits I'd earned with shrapnel scars and sleepless nights. Chen asked if I'd noticed anything suspicious over the past 2 years, any conversations that seemed odd, any questions about my medical history that felt too detailed, any offers to help that came with strings attached. I thought back to family dinners where Jessica had casually asked about my pain levels, whether I'd considered filing for increased compensation, if I knew that veterans with certain diagnoses qualified for additional benefits. At the time, her interest had felt caring, sisterly. Now it felt like reconnaissance. The hardest part wasn't learning about the money she'd stolen. It was realizing how long she'd been planning it. Chen showed me email chains dating back 3 years, conversations between Jessica and other VA employees about benefit fraud prevention, discussions of how the system could be exploited, theoretical conversations that now read like planning sessions. She'd been studying the vulnerabilities in veteran benefit programs while hugging me at Christmas dinner and asking how my leg was healing. 2 weeks after my meeting with Agent Chen, I got a call at 6 in the morning. His voice was calm but urgent, the tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. The warrant had been approved. The raid was happening today. Did I want to be there? Not as a participant, but as a witness. To see justice served in real time. To watch the house that my sacrifice had built get torn apart by federal agents looking for evidence. I drove to Phoenix in the pre-dawn darkness, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months. The neighborhood looked different at sunrise, less perfect, more vulnerable. The manicured lawns and matching mailboxes seemed like stage props waiting for the real show to begin. I parked 3 blocks away, where Chen had told me to wait, and watched through binoculars as black SUVs took positions around Jessica's dream house. The raid began at 7:15 a.m. with a knock that could probably be heard 3 houses away. Jessica answered the door in a silk robe, coffee mug still in her hand, face cycling through confusion and terror as Agent Chen showed his badge and explained why a dozen federal agents were about to inventory everything she owned. Her perfect composure, the professional mask she'd worn for years, cracked completely when she saw the search warrant. She tried to close the door. They walked through it anyway. I watched from my car as agents carried out boxes of documents, computer equipment, and financial records. Jessica's BMW was photographed from every angle, the registration checked against her declared income. The fountain in her front yard, the one that had impressed me so much during my first visit, got measured and documented as potential evidence of unexplained wealth. Every luxury that had been purchased with my stolen benefits became an exhibit in a federal crime scene. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, phones out, recording the destruction of Jessica's carefully constructed image. The woman who'd helped organize neighborhood watch meetings and charity fundraisers was now the center of a federal investigation that would make local news by noon. Her professional reputation, built over years of competent service at the VA hospital, was disintegrating in real time as agents loaded evidence into government vehicles. Jessica called me while the raid was still happening. I could hear agents talking in the background, drawers being opened, papers rustling. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the confidence that had carried her through medical school and up the administrative ladder. She wanted to explain, to make me understand that it hadn't started as theft, that the first payment had been an accident she'd meant to report. But we both knew that was a lie. Accidents don't buy Mediterranean-style houses and luxury cars. She asked if I could help her, if I could talk to the investigators, tell them she'd been planning to pay it back. The desperation in her voice would have moved me once. Before I knew she'd been stealing my benefits while I counted pills and avoided crowds, before I learned she'd been living in luxury funded by my nightmares. Now it just sounded like someone finally facing consequences they'd spent years convincing themselves would never come. The raid lasted 4 hours. By the time the agents finished, Jessica's perfect life looked like a crime scene. Yellow tape across the driveway, evidence tags on everything valuable enough to be connected to the fraud. Her neighbors watched from behind curtains as she was led to a government sedan, not in handcuffs yet, but with the kind of dignity reserved for white-collar criminals who knew the cameras were rolling. Agent Chen called me that evening with the preliminary numbers. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud dating back almost 3 years. The total amount stolen exceeded $60,000 when they included the medical equipment purchases and the fraudulent therapy claims. Jessica had been so confident in her system that she'd kept detailed records, spreadsheets tracking every payment, every falsified document, every lie told to federal agencies. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. The organizational skills that had made her successful at the VA hospital, the attention to detail that had impressed her supervisors, had created a paper trail so comprehensive that building a federal case became almost effortless. She documented her own crimes with the same meticulous care she'd once used to help veterans navigate benefit claims. That night, I sat in my small apartment and tried to process what I'd witnessed. The sister who'd driven me to medical appointments had been arrested for stealing the benefits those appointments had established. The house I'd admired was now evidence in a federal case. The life she'd built on my stolen benefits was collapsing as methodically as she'd constructed it. But the strangest feeling wasn't satisfaction or revenge, it was relief. For the first time in months, the weight I'd been carrying felt lighter. Not because Jessica was facing consequences, but because the truth was finally visible. The fraud had been exposed, documented, and witnessed. There was no more guessing, no more suspicion, no more wondering if I was imagining things or being paranoid. The system that had failed to protect my benefits was now working to recover them. The agencies that had been fooled by Jessica's manipulation were now building a case that would ensure she never worked in veteran services again. The justice I'd never expected to see was unfolding with the same systematic precision she'd used to steal from me. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and restitution hearings and the slow process of rebuilding trust in institutions that had let me down. But tonight, I could finally sleep without wondering who else was profiting from my sacrifice. The courtroom smelled like old wood and broken promises. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching my sister's defense attorney shuffle through papers that couldn't change the mountain of evidence stacked against her. Jessica wore a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a style that made her look younger, more vulnerable. It was a carefully calculated image designed to generate sympathy from jurors who would decide whether her 3 years of systematic theft deserved federal prison time. Her guilty plea had surprised everyone except Agent Chen. The evidence was so overwhelming that taking it to trial would have been professional suicide for any defense lawyer. Bank records, computer files, forged documents, recorded phone calls where Jessica discussed my medical condition with VA colleagues while simultaneously planning her next fraudulent claim. The prosecution had built a case so airtight that even Jessica's expensive legal team couldn't find cracks to exploit. The judge was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who'd spent 30 years separating truth from performance in federal courtrooms. She'd seen white-collar criminals before, people who wore suits and spoke in measured tones while systematically destroying lives through paperwork and computer screens. When she looked at Jessica, I could tell she wasn't impressed by the tears or the carefully worded apology that followed the guilty plea. Jessica's statement to the court lasted 12 minutes. She talked about making mistakes, about losing perspective, about the pressure of managing complex benefit cases at the VA hospital. She mentioned my service and sacrifice, how proud she was of my military career, how sorry she was that her actions had caused me additional pain. The words were polished, probably written by her legal team, delivered with just enough emotion to seem genuine without appearing rehearsed. What she didn't mention was the BMW payments she'd made with my stolen benefits, the vacation to Hawaii funded by fraudulent medical equipment claims, The kitchen renovation paid for with disability compensation that should have helped me buy groceries and prescription medications. Her apology focused on abstract concepts like poor judgment and momentary lapses, carefully avoiding the concrete reality of luxury purchases made with money stolen from a wounded veteran. The prosecution's response was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, a woman who spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent years prosecuting people who exploited veterans. She didn't raise her voice or gesture dramatically. She simply read from the evidence file, detailing each fraudulent transaction, each forged document, each lie told to federal agencies over the course of 36 months. The numbers were devastating in their consistency. Jessica hadn't made a mistake or suffered a momentary lapse. She'd operated a criminal enterprise with the methodical precision of someone running a business. Martinez presented victim impact statements from 3 other veterans whose benefits had been compromised during Jessica's time at the Phoenix VA. I hadn't known about them during the investigation, but Jessica's access to the computer system had allowed her to manipulate multiple files, not just mine. A Marine who'd lost partial hearing in Afghanistan had been denied legitimate hearing aid benefits while Jessica processed fraudulent claims for equipment that never existed. A Navy veteran seeking treatment for chemical exposure had waited months for approval, while Jessica fast-tracked fake therapy sessions that generated payments to accounts she controlled. The scope of the fraud was broader than anyone had initially realized. Jessica hadn't just stolen from family. She'd turned her position at the VA into a systematic operation that victimized veterans across multiple benefit categories. The total amount exceeded $90,000 when the prosecution included all the documented cases. She'd been running a sophisticated criminal network from inside the very agency designed to serve the people she was robbing. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a statement, I stood slowly, my reconstructed leg protesting the movement. I'd written notes, pages of thoughts about betrayal and family and the weight of serving your country only to be robbed by someone you trusted. But standing there, looking at Jessica's carefully composed expression, most of those words felt unnecessary. The evidence had already spoken. The other victims had already been heard. What I needed to say was simpler and more personal. I talked about trust, about how veterans depend on family members to help navigate systems designed by people who've never worn a uniform. I mentioned the nights I'd struggled to pay for medications while Jessica was depositing my stolen benefits into accounts I didn't know existed. I described the months of wondering if I was imagining things, if the financial struggles were my fault, if I was being paranoid about paperwork that didn't make sense. But mostly, I talked about the other veterans who'd been victimized, the ones who might never know their benefits had been manipulated, who might still be waiting for help that had been redirected to fund someone else's lifestyle. Jessica hadn't just stolen money. She'd undermined the entire system of trust that veterans depend on when they're most vulnerable.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She turned healing into a crime scene and family loyalty into a weapon. The judge sentenced Jessica to 38 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She would be required to pay full restitution to all victims, plus penalties and interest. Her medical license was permanently revoked. She was banned from ever working in veteran services again. The house would be sold to help pay the restitution. The BMW would be auctioned. Everything purchased with stolen benefits would be liquidated to help repair the damage she'd caused. Jessica's face didn't change when the sentence was announced. She'd probably expected prison time, had prepared herself for the reality of federal consequences. But I saw something break in her posture when the judge mentioned the permanent ban from veteran services. That had been her identity, her professional pride, the career she'd built over years of competent service before greed corrupted her judgment. Losing that forever hit harder than the prison sentence. After the hearing, Agent Chen walked me to my car in the courthouse parking garage. The case was officially closed, but the investigation had led to broader reforms at the Phoenix VA. New oversight procedures, enhanced computer security, mandatory cross-checks for benefit claims involving staff members' family connections. Jessica's fraud had exposed vulnerabilities that affected veterans across the entire system. Her crimes had inadvertently created protections that would prevent similar theft in the future. The restitution process took 8 months, liquidating Jessica's assets, processing insurance claims, coordinating payments to multiple victims across different benefit categories. I received $43,000 in recovered benefits, plus interest and penalties that brought the total to nearly $55,000. It was more money than I'd ever had in savings, compensation for years of struggling while my sister lived in luxury funded by my sacrifice. I used part of the restitution to move out of the studio apartment into a small house with a yard and a garage where I could work on restoring a vintage motorcycle I'd always wanted. The rest went into savings and investments that would provide security I'd never been able to afford. For the first time since coming home from Iraq, financial stress wasn't a constant weight on my decisions about medical care, prescription medications, or basic necessities. But the most significant change wasn't financial, it was psychological. The validation that came from seeing Jessica held accountable, from watching the system work properly when evidence was overwhelming and justice was pursued methodically. I'd spent years doubting myself, wondering if I was being paranoid or oversensitive when things didn't add up. The federal investigation had confirmed that my instincts were correct, that the inconsistencies I noticed were real, that the family member I'd trusted had been systematically betraying that trust. I started volunteering with a veteran advocacy group that helped other former service members navigate benefit claims and spot potential fraud. The experience of being victimized had given me insights into how the system could be exploited, knowledge that helped protect other veterans from similar schemes. I worked with Agent Chen's office to develop training materials for VA staff about recognizing internal fraud patterns and protecting veteran information from unauthorized access. 6 months after Jessica began serving her sentence, I received a letter from her in federal prison. She asked for forgiveness, said she'd been attending counseling sessions, and had begun to understand the full impact of her actions. She wanted to rebuild our relationship when she was released, to make amends in whatever way possible. The letter was handwritten, personal, in a way her courtroom apology had never been. I read it twice, then filed it away without responding. Not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness wasn't something that could be earned through letters or prison counseling sessions. Trust, once broken so completely, required more than words to rebuild. Perhaps someday we could have a conversation about what had happened and why, but that conversation would happen on my timeline, not hers, and only if I decided the relationship was worth salvaging. The motorcycle restoration became a meditation, a way of rebuilding something from damaged components. Every evening after work, I'd spend time in the garage, cleaning parts, replacing worn elements, slowly returning the machine to its original purpose. The process reminded me that broken things could be repaired, that damage didn't have to be permanent, that with patience and the right tools, even the most complex problems could be solved methodically. Some nights, when the desert air was cool and the work was particularly satisfying, I'd think about Jessica in her federal prison cell, learning that actions have consequences and that some mistakes can't be fixed with apologies or good intentions. The justice system had worked, but justice and healing weren't the same thing. One was institutional, delivered through courts and sentences. The other was personal, earned through time and reflection and the slow process of deciding what kind of person you wanted to be after betrayal. I never bought my sister back, but I got something more valuable, the knowledge that when institutions work properly, truth emerges and consequences follow. That veterans looking out for each other can create protections stronger than any individual criminal enterprise. That trust, once rebuilt on solid foundations, becomes more resilient than naive faith ever could be. 3 years later, I stood in front of a conference room filled with VA administrators, federal investigators, and veteran advocates, sharing my story as part of a nationwide fraud prevention training program. The PowerPoint slides behind me showed statistics that would have been unimaginable when Jessica first started stealing my benefits. Internal fraud cases had increased by 40% over the past 5 years. Family members accounted for nearly a quarter of all veteran benefit theft. The average amount stolen per case had risen to over $70,000. My role had evolved from victim to educator, helping VA offices across the country recognize the warning signs that might have caught Jessica's scheme earlier. I traveled to regional training sessions, spoke at veteran service organization conferences, and worked with federal prosecutors to understand how family-based fraud operated differently from stranger identity theft. The personal betrayal element made these cases more complex emotionally and legally, requiring specialized approaches that traditional fraud prevention didn't address. The audience that morning included staff from the Phoenix VA where Jessica had worked. Some of them had known her professionally, had collaborated on legitimate cases before learning about her criminal activities. I could see the discomfort on their faces as I described how she'd exploited institutional trust and family relationships to build her fraud network. They were grappling with the same questions I'd faced. How do you recognize deception from someone you trust completely? During the break, a young social worker approached me privately. She was reviewing old cases and had found irregularities in benefit claims involving veteran family members in administrative roles. Nothing as blatant as Jessica's scheme, but patterns that made her uncomfortable. Duplicate addresses, questionable medical documentation, benefit redirections that couldn't be easily explained. She wanted guidance on how to investigate without destroying relationships if her suspicions were wrong. I gave her Agent Chen's contact information and suggested she document everything before approaching anyone directly. Family fraud investigations required careful handling because false accusations could devastate relationships, while missed red flags allowed criminal activity to continue. The balance between trust and verification had become the central challenge in preventing insider abuse of veteran benefit systems. That afternoon, I drove to the federal prison where Jessica was completing her final months of incarceration. We'd been corresponding regularly for the past year, cautious letters that gradually progressed from formal apologies to more personal conversations about accountability and repair. She'd participated in victim impact programs, financial responsibility counseling, and educational courses designed to help white-collar criminals understand the broader consequences of their actions. The visiting room was sterile and supervised, conversations monitored by guards who'd heard every variation of criminal justification and family reconciliation. Jessica looked different after 3 years in federal custody. Thinner, more serious, wearing the kind of understated confidence that comes from accepting responsibility rather than avoiding it. Her hair was shorter, practical rather than styled. Her clothes were prison-issued but neat, reflecting habits of precision that had once made her an effective administrator and an efficient criminal. We talked about her reentry plans, the job training programs she'd completed, the nonprofit organizations that helped formerly incarcerated individuals rebuild their lives. She would never work in healthcare or veteran services again, but she'd developed skills in accounting and business administration that could translate to legitimate employment in other sectors. Her probation officer had already approved several potential job opportunities with companies that hired people with federal convictions. The conversation was careful, measured, avoiding the emotional landmines that had made earlier discussions difficult. We both understood that forgiveness was a process, not a declaration, something that developed through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. Jessica had used her time in prison constructively, but rebuilding trust would require years of demonstrated integrity after her release. I was willing to participate in that process, but only if she remained committed to transparency and accountability. She asked about my advocacy work, the training programs I helped develop, the legislative changes that had emerged from high-profile fraud cases like hers. I described the new oversight protocols, the enhanced computer security systems, the mandatory reporting requirements that made internal fraud harder to sustain. Her case had become a teaching tool, an example of how institutional vulnerabilities could be exploited and subsequently addressed through policy reform. Jessica listened without defensiveness, asking specific questions that surprised me with their technical sophistication. She understood the VA's computer systems better than most investigators, knowledge that could potentially help prevent future fraud if she could find appropriate ways to contribute. I suggested she consider consulting with law enforcement agencies after her release, using her expertise to identify vulnerabilities from the perspective of someone who'd successfully exploited them. The idea intrigued her, though we both recognized the complexity of a convicted fraudster working with federal agencies to prevent the crimes she'd once committed. It would require exceptional oversights and carefully defined boundaries, but her inside knowledge of how benefit fraud operated could be valuable in developing more effective prevention strategies. Several white-collar criminals had successfully transitioned into legitimate fraud prevention careers, using their criminal experience to help organizations protect themselves. After visiting Jessica, I drove to a veteran community center in Tempe where I volunteer as a benefits counselor. The work involves helping former service members navigate legitimate claims processes, understand their entitlements, and avoid the confusion that makes them vulnerable to family members or strangers who might exploit their benefits. Many of the veterans I work with have similar stories. Trusted relatives who offered to help with paperwork, then disappeared with payments or diverted benefits to unauthorized accounts. That evening's group included a Marine veteran whose brother had been forging his signature on benefit forms, an Army nurse whose sister had stolen her identity to claim medical equipment benefits, and a Navy veteran whose son had been intercepting his disability payments for over a year. The commonality in their experiences was devastating. Family members who understood military culture and veteran benefit systems using that knowledge to exploit the people they should have been protecting. I shared my experience with Jessica, emphasizing that family fraud victims often blame themselves for trusting people they loved. The guilt and self-doubt that follows this type of betrayal can be as damaging as the financial theft, creating psychological wounds that take years to heal. Recovery involves accepting that love and trust aren't character flaws, even when they're exploited by people who should never have betrayed them. The group discussions were intense but therapeutic, providing space for veterans to process anger and disappointment without judgment. Many had been isolated by their experiences, unwilling to discuss family criminal activity with friends or other relatives who might not understand the complexity of loving someone who'd stolen from them. Finding community with others who'd survived similar betrayals created pathways for healing that individual counseling couldn't always provide. One veteran asked about forgiveness, whether maintaining relationships with family members who'd committed benefit fraud was healthy or enabling. I shared my experience with Jessica, explaining that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or returning to previous levels of trust. It could mean accepting someone's accountability and supporting their rehabilitation while maintaining appropriate boundaries and protective measures. The question sparked debate among group members. Some had completely severed relationships with family members who'd stolen their benefits. Others had maintained contact, but with strict limitations and financial safeguards. A few had successfully rebuilt relationships after family members completed restitution and demonstrated genuine change. There was no universal approach because family dynamics, criminal behavior patterns, and individual healing processes varied significantly. After the group session, I stayed late to update case files and coordinate with legal aid attorneys who helped veterans pursue restitution or report ongoing fraud. The paperwork was extensive but necessary, creating documentation that could support federal investigations or civil recovery actions. Many veterans lacked the resources to pursue legal remedies independently, making advocacy organizations essential for ensuring accountability and justice. Driving home through the desert night, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since discovering Jessica's theft.
The betrayal that had initially devastated me had become the foundation for meaningful work helping other veterans protect themselves and recover from similar crimes. The knowledge I'd gained through investigation and prosecution processes had equipped me to guide others through the complex systems required to achieve justice and healing. The house I'd purchased with restitution money felt like home in ways my previous apartments never had. The garage where I worked on motorcycle restoration projects provided space for meditation and reflection. The yard where I grew vegetables and maintained a small garden connected me to earth and growth cycles that reminded me of life's capacity for renewal. Everything I'd built represented choices made from strength rather than desperation, possibilities created from the ruins of broken trust. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if Jessica had never been caught, if the computer audit had missed her fraud patterns, if I'd continued struggling financially while she lived in luxury funded by my stolen benefits. Would the resentment have consumed me? Would I have eventually discovered the theft through other means? Would our family relationships have deteriorated in different ways as her criminal behavior expanded? Those questions couldn't be answered, but they reinforced my commitment to helping other veterans avoid prolonged victimization. Early detection and swift accountability prevented fraud from metastasizing into larger criminal enterprises while preserving possibilities for relationship repair and personal healing. The sooner criminal behavior was addressed, the better the outcomes for everyone involved, including the perpetrators who often needed intervention before their crimes escalated beyond redemption. 5 years had passed since the day I first held that VA investigation letter in my shaking hands, and the world had shifted in ways I never could have anticipated. Standing at the podium of the National Veterans Affairs Convention in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of 1,500 administrators, advocates, and former service members, I felt the weight of every stolen dollar, every betrayed trust, every sleepless night that had led to this moment. The speech I was about to give would mark the official launch of the Veterans Family Fraud Prevention Initiative, a nationwide program born from the ashes of my sister's crimes. The conference hall buzzed with conversations in a dozen languages, representatives from veteran organizations across America and several international delegations studying how the United States had begun addressing internal benefit fraud. My presentation was titled From Victim to Advocate, Building Systemic Protections Through Personal Experience, but the real story was more complex than any title could capture. It was about transformation, about how individual trauma could become collective healing when channeled through institutional change. Jessica had been released from federal prison 6 months earlier, completing her sentence with the kind of methodical compliance that had once made her an effective administrator. Her re-entry into civilian life had been carefully planned through programs designed for white-collar offenders who posed minimal risk of violent recidivism but required extensive monitoring to prevent financial crimes. She was living in a halfway house in Tucson, working at a nonprofit organization that helped formerly incarcerated individuals develop job skills and rebuild their lives. Our relationship remained complicated, built on foundation stones of accountability and forgiveness that shifted constantly as we both continued processing the damage her crimes had caused. We met monthly for supervised coffee visits, conversations that were part family reconciliation and part ongoing restorative justice process. Jessica's probation officer attended these meetings, ensuring that our interactions remained focused on healing rather than enabling or manipulation. The structure felt artificial sometimes, but it provided safety nets that allowed us to explore rebuilding trust without risking further harm. The nonprofit where Jessica worked had been carefully vetted by federal authorities before approving her employment. The organization served individuals transitioning from incarceration to civilian employment, focusing on financial literacy, job placement, and long-term stability. Jessica's role involved basic data entry and filing, work that kept her away from financial decisions or client benefit information. Her supervisor was aware of her criminal history and maintained strict oversight of her access to organizational resources and client information. During our most recent visit, Jessica had shared insights about the psychological progression that had led to her crimes, observations developed through years of mandated counseling and self-reflection programs. She described how small compromises in ethical standards had accumulated over time, each rationalized as temporary or justified by circumstances that seemed reasonable at the moment. The first fraudulent transaction had felt like correcting an administrative error. The second had been rationalized as addressing systemic inefficiencies. By the 10th, she was operating a criminal enterprise while convincing herself she was helping veterans navigate bureaucratic obstacles. Her analysis was clinically precise in ways that both impressed and disturbed me. Jessica understood the mechanics of her own corruption with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to legitimate benefit processing. This self-awareness was encouraging for rehabilitation purposes, but it also highlighted how systematically she'd deceived herself and others during the years when she was actively stealing. The capacity for rationalization that had enabled her crimes was the same intellectual framework she now used to understand and prevent similar behavior. Jessica's insights had become valuable to fraud prevention specialists working to identify early warning signs in VA employees who might be tempted by similar opportunities. Her case study was used in training programs, with her permission and participation, to help administrators recognize how small ethical compromises could escalate into major criminal activity. She participated in these sessions anonymously, speaking from behind screens or through video conferences that protected her privacy while sharing her expertise. The irony was profound. The person who had once exploited veteran benefits was now helping protect them, using her knowledge of criminal methodologies to strengthen institutional defenses. Federal authorities had approached this arrangement with appropriate caution, implementing multiple oversight mechanisms to ensure that Jessica's involvement remained constructive rather than manipulative. Her participation was voluntary and could be terminated immediately if concerns arose about her motivations or behavior. My own evolution from fraud victim to national advocate had been equally unexpected but less controversial.
The expertise I'd gained through investigating Jessica's crimes and navigating federal prosecution processes had equipped me with unique insights into how family-based benefit fraud operated and could be prevented. Veterans Affairs administrators across the country had begun consulting with me about suspicious cases, unusual benefit patterns, and policy recommendations for protecting vulnerable veterans from exploitation by trusted family members. The work was emotionally demanding but professionally fulfilling in ways I'd never experienced during my military service or civilian employment afterward. Every case I helped resolve prevented other veterans from experiencing the betrayal and financial hardship that had nearly destroyed my faith in institutional systems. The knowledge that my suffering had been transformed into protection for others provided meaning that transcended personal healing and approached something like redemption. My advocacy had led to consulting relationships with federal agencies, veteran service organizations, and congressional committees working on benefit fraud prevention legislation. The technical expertise required was substantial, demanding fluency in federal regulation, computer security protocols, criminal investigation procedures, and victim services coordination. I'd completed certification programs in fraud examination, victim advocacy, and organizational psychology to ensure that my recommendations were grounded in professional standards rather than personal experience alone. The Veterans Family Fraud Prevention Initiative represented the culmination of 5 years of policy development, stakeholder coordination, and legislative advocacy. The program would establish standardized protocols for investigating internal fraud cases, create mandatory training requirements for VA employees with access to benefit systems, and implement technological safeguards that made unauthorized transactions more difficult to execute and easier to detect. Funding came from congressional appropriations supported by veteran advocacy organizations and fraud prevention specialists who understood the scope of the problem. Statistical analysis had revealed that family-based benefit fraud was significantly more common than previously recognized, partly because victims were reluctant to report crimes committed by relatives, and partly because institutional systems weren't designed to detect internal manipulation by individuals with legitimate access to computer networks and confidential information. Jessica's case had been unusual in its sophistication and duration, but the basic methodology was disturbingly common among VA employees who understood benefit processing systems and had family members receiving veteran services. The financial impact was staggering when calculated across the entire veteran population.
Conservative estimates suggested that family fraud cost the VA system over $200 million annually, money that should have supported legitimate veteran needs, but instead funded criminal enterprises operated by trusted relatives and acquaintances. The psychological impact was harder to quantify, but potentially more damaging, undermining veteran confidence in support systems and creating barriers to accessing legitimate benefits. Early detection programs had shown remarkable success in pilot implementations across 6 regional VA offices. Computer algorithms designed to identify unusual benefit patterns had flagged suspected fraud cases that human administrators had missed, leading to investigations that prevented millions of dollars in additional theft. Training programs that taught VA employees to recognize manipulation tactics had improved reporting rates and accelerated intervention processes. Victim support services had helped defrauded veterans navigate recovery procedures and rebuild trust in institutional systems. The technology component involved sophisticated database monitoring that tracked benefit payments, medical appointment scheduling, and document processing for unusual patterns that might indicate fraudulent activity. Machine learning algorithms analyzed millions of transactions to identify statistical anomalies that warranted human investigation. Privacy protections ensured that legitimate veteran activity wasn't unnecessarily scrutinized while maintaining effective surveillance of potential criminal behavior. Implementation challenges were substantial, requiring coordination between federal agencies, state veteran organizations, and local service providers, who often operated with limited resources and competing priorities. Cultural resistance came from VA employees who viewed increased oversight as questioning their professional integrity, and from veteran advocates who worried that fraud prevention measures might create additional barriers for legitimate benefit claimants. Balancing security with accessibility required careful policy development and extensive stakeholder consultation. Congressional support had been essential for securing funding and regulatory authority needed to implement nationwide fraud prevention measures. Testifying before the House Veterans Affairs Committee had been intimidating but crucial for explaining how individual fraud cases reflected systemic vulnerabilities that required legislative solutions. Committee members had been particularly interested in cost-benefit analyses, demonstrating that fraud prevention investments would save money over time while improving services for legitimate veteran benefit recipients. Media coverage of veteran benefit fraud had increased public awareness, but also created political pressure for dramatic responses that might not represent effective policy solutions. Balancing public accountability with operational effectiveness required careful communication strategies that emphasized factual information over sensational narratives. My role often involved translating complex technical information into accessible language that helped journalists and politicians understand fraud prevention challenges without oversimplifying institutional complexities. Professional recognition for my advocacy work had included awards from veteran service organizations, invitations to speak at national conferences, and consultation opportunities with federal agencies and academic researchers studying benefit fraud patterns. The recognition was gratifying, but secondary to the concrete progress achieved in protecting veterans from exploitation by family members and institutional insiders who might abuse their access to confidential information and financial systems. International attention had emerged as other countries grappled with similar challenges in their veteran service systems. Delegations from Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom had visited VA offices implementing fraud prevention protocols, seeking insights that could inform their own policy development. The global scope of the problem suggested that family-based benefit fraud was an inherent vulnerability in systems designed to serve individuals with complex medical and financial needs. Research collaborations with university programs studying white-collar crime had produced academic papers analyzing family fraud patterns and prevention strategies. The scholarly work provided theoretical frameworks for understanding why trusted relatives might exploit veteran benefits and how institutional systems could be designed to prevent such exploitation without creating excessive barriers for legitimate claimants. Academic credibility enhanced the policy recommendations I provided to government agencies and advocacy organizations. Teaching opportunities had developed at several universities with graduate programs in public administration, criminal justice, and social work. Guest lectures on veteran benefit fraud provided learning experiences for students who might work in government agencies or nonprofit organizations serving former military personnel. Academic settings allowed for deeper exploration of ethical issues, policy alternatives, and systemic challenges that couldn't be addressed comprehensively in advocacy contexts. The healing process continued to evolve as my understanding of trauma and recovery deepened through professional development and personal experience. Therapy had been essential for processing the complex emotions surrounding Jessica's betrayal and the systemic failures that had enabled her crimes. Individual counseling, support groups, and specialized treatment for trauma related to institutional betrayal had provided tools for managing anger, rebuilding trust, and channeling difficult experiences into constructive advocacy work. Family dynamics remained complicated as extended relatives struggled to understand how Jessica's crimes had affected our relationships and whether maintaining contact with her was appropriate or enabling. Some family members had completely severed ties with Jessica, viewing her criminal behavior as unforgivable betrayal of military service and family loyalty. Others had maintained limited contact, but with clear boundaries and expectations for accountability and behavioral change. Holiday gatherings and family celebrations required careful navigation of emotions and expectations that hadn't fully healed despite years of counseling and attempted reconciliation. Jessica's absence during her incarceration had created space for family healing, but her release had reopened questions about forgiveness, trust, and whether relationships damaged by criminal behavior could be repaired without compromising personal safety or emotional well-being. The financial recovery had been more straightforward than the emotional healing, though still complex and time-consuming. Restitution payments had been processed through federal oversight mechanisms that ensured accurate accounting and appropriate distribution to all identified victims. Insurance claims and asset liquidation generated additional recovery funds, though the total amount never fully compensated for years of financial hardship and credit damage caused by Jessica's theft. Investment strategies developed with financial advisors who specialized in serving veterans had helped grow the recovered funds into long-term financial security that I'd never previously achieved. Conservative investment approaches prioritize stability over growth, reflecting hard-earned lessons about the importance of maintaining control over financial resources and avoiding situations that might make me vulnerable to future exploitation by trusted individuals.
Real estate investments involved purchasing a duplex property that provided rental income while allowing me to offer affordable housing to veterans transitioning from homelessness or incarceration. The property management work connected me with formerly homeless veterans whose stories often included exploitation by family members who had stolen their benefits or manipulated their financial resources. These connections reinforced my understanding of how common family fraud was among veteran populations and how devastating the impact can be on already vulnerable individuals. Volunteer work with veteran service organizations had expanded beyond fraud prevention into broader advocacy for improved mental health services, housing assistance, and employment support programs. The skills developed through fraud investigation and policy advocacy had proven transferable to other veteran issues that required technical expertise, stakeholder coordination, and legislative engagement. My network of professional contacts included VA administrators, congressional staff members, and nonprofit leaders working on various veteran-related initiatives. Motorcycle restoration continued to provide therapeutic benefits, requiring focus and patience that helped manage stress and process difficult emotions. The garage workshop had become a space for meditation and reflection, where the methodical work of rebuilding damaged machines paralleled the process of reconstructing life and relationships after betrayal and trauma. Completed restoration projects were sold to fund veteran support activities or donated to organizations serving disabled veterans who couldn't afford reliable transportation. The vintage motorcycle community included many veterans who shared interests in mechanical work and found healing through hands-on projects that produced tangible results. Group rides and motorcycle events provided social connections with individuals who understood military culture and veteran experiences without requiring extensive explanation or emotional labor. These relationships were built on shared interests rather than trauma processing, providing balance to advocacy work that often involved intense focus on negative experiences. Community college courses in small engine repair and metalworking enhanced my restoration skills while providing career development opportunities that could supplement advocacy income. Teaching basic motorcycle maintenance to other veterans created additional income streams while sharing skills that could provide employment opportunities for individuals transitioning from military service or recovering from various personal challenges. The mechanical knowledge gained through restoration work had unexpected applications in fraud investigation, where understanding how complex systems could be manipulated required similar analytical thinking and attention to detail. The ability to trace problems through interconnected components, identify failure points, and develop systematic repair approaches translated well to analyzing financial fraud schemes and developing prevention strategies. Writing projects had included contributing chapters to academic books about veteran benefit fraud, publishing articles in professional journals focused on fraud prevention, and developing training materials for VA employees and veteran service organization staff. The writing required translating personal experience into professional expertise while maintaining appropriate boundaries between advocacy work and emotional processing of trauma. My role often involved translating complex technical information into accessible language that helped journalists and politicians understand fraud prevention challenges without oversimplifying institutional complexities. Professional recognition for my advocacy work had included awards from veteran service organizations, invitations to speak at national conferences, and consultation opportunities with federal agencies and academic researchers studying benefit fraud patterns. The recognition was gratifying, but secondary to the concrete progress achieved in protecting veterans from exploitation by family members and institutional insiders who might abuse their access to confidential information and financial systems.
Book proposals for a comprehensive memoir about family fraud and institutional betrayal had attracted interest from publishers specializing in veteran narratives and social justice issues. The potential publication represented an opportunity to reach broader audiences with information about fraud prevention while generating income that could support continued advocacy work. Editorial consultations had helped develop narrative structures that balanced personal storytelling with policy analysis and practical guidance for other fraud victims. Speaking engagements had evolved from basic testimony about Jessica's crimes to sophisticated presentations analyzing fraud prevention strategies, victim recovery processes, and institutional reform recommendations. Professional development in public speaking and presentation design had improved my effectiveness at conferences, training sessions, and media interviews. The ability to communicate complex information clearly and persuasively had become essential for advocacy success. Media training had prepared me for television interviews, radio appearances, and podcast discussions that reached audiences beyond the veteran community. Discussing family fraud in public forums required careful attention to privacy concerns while providing enough detail to help other potential victims recognize warning signs and seek appropriate assistance. Balancing personal disclosure with professional expertise required ongoing consultation with media specialists and legal advisors. Documentary film projects had included participation in investigative pieces examining veteran benefit fraud, institutional failures in federal agencies, and the impact of white-collar crime on military families. The film work provided opportunities to reach broader audiences while controlling narrative elements that protected privacy and promoted accurate understanding of fraud prevention challenges. Collaboration with filmmakers required careful contract negotiation to ensure that my participation supported advocacy goals rather than exploiting personal trauma for entertainment purposes. Political engagement had expanded to include campaign support for candidates who prioritized veteran issues and fraud prevention legislation. Volunteer work for political campaigns provided opportunities to influence policy development while building relationships with elected officials who could advance veteran-focused initiatives. The partisan political environment required careful navigation to maintain credibility with diverse stakeholder groups while advocating for specific policy changes. Lobbying activities had included organizing veteran advocacy days where fraud survivors met with congressional representatives to discuss legislation and share personal experiences. These events required substantial coordination and preparation but produced meaningful policy conversations that influenced legislative development. The ability to connect personal stories with technical policy analysis had proven particularly effective for generating political support for fraud prevention funding. International speaking opportunities had emerged as other countries sought expertise in developing veteran benefit fraud prevention programs. Travel to conferences in Europe and Australia provided perspectives on how different government structures and cultural contexts affected fraud prevention strategies. The comparative analysis enhanced my understanding of systemic vulnerabilities while building international networks that could support collaborative research and policy development. Consulting contracts with foreign governments had included reviewing their veteran service systems for fraud vulnerabilities and recommending prevention strategies adapted to their legal frameworks and cultural contexts. The international work required understanding complex regulatory environments while translating American prevention strategies into approaches that would be effective in different institutional settings. Academic conferences had provided opportunities to present research findings and engage with scholars studying various aspects of white-collar crime, victim recovery, and institutional reform. The academic community offered theoretical frameworks for understanding fraud prevention challenges while providing platforms for sharing practical insights gained through advocacy experience. The intersection of academic research and practical advocacy had enhanced both areas of work. Professional associations had included membership in organizations focused on fraud examination, victim advocacy, and veteran services. Active participation in these associations provided access to professional development opportunities while building networks that supported advocacy work and career advancement. Leadership roles in professional organizations had created platforms for promoting veteran-specific fraud prevention initiatives. Mentorship relationships had developed with younger advocates entering the veteran services field, individuals seeking career transitions into fraud prevention work, and veterans beginning their own healing journeys after experiencing family betrayal or institutional failures. Providing guidance to others had reinforced my own recovery while contributing to leadership development in the veteran advocacy community. The mentorship work included formal programs through veteran service organizations and informal relationships that developed through speaking engagements and professional conferences. Many mentees were veterans who had experienced various forms of exploitation or institutional betrayal and were seeking ways to channel their experiences into constructive advocacy work. Sharing practical guidance about career development, professional networks, and emotional self-care had become an important component of my advocacy activities. Supervision responsibilities had emerged as fraud prevention programs expanded and required experienced staff to oversee implementation and training activities. Managing other advocates and technical specialists required leadership skills that built on military experience while addressing civilian workplace dynamics and professional development needs. The supervision work provided career advancement opportunities while ensuring that fraud prevention programs maintained quality standards and effective service delivery.
Training development had included curriculum materials for VA employees, Veteran Service Organization staff, and fraud investigation specialists who needed technical knowledge about family-based benefit fraud. The training programs required translating complex information into accessible formats while maintaining accuracy and comprehensiveness. Evaluation data from training participants had confirmed the effectiveness of programs that combined personal narrative with technical expertise. Certification programs had been completed in fraud examination, victim advocacy, and organizational development to ensure that my advocacy work met professional standards and remained current with evolving best practices. The continuing education requirements maintained technical competency while providing networking opportunities with other professionals working on related issues. Quality assurance responsibilities had included reviewing fraud prevention protocols implemented at various VA facilities and recommending improvements based on evaluation data and stakeholder feedback. The quality assurance work required analytical skills and attention to detail that drew on both military experience and fraud investigation expertise. Regular facility visits provided opportunities to observe prevention programs in action while identifying areas for improvement. Grant writing activities supported funding applications for fraud prevention research, victim services programs, and technology development initiatives. The grant writing required technical knowledge about fraud prevention strategies while demonstrating clear connections between proposed activities and measurable outcomes. Successful grant applications generated millions of dollars in funding for programs serving veteran fraud victims and implementing prevention strategies. Partnership development had included building collaborative relationships between government agencies, nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, and private sector companies working on fraud prevention initiatives. The partnership work required diplomatic skills and strategic thinking to align diverse organizational interests while advancing shared goals of protecting veterans from exploitation. Technology development had included consultation on software systems designed to detect fraudulent benefit transactions, secure databases containing veteran information, and streamline investigation processes. The technology work required understanding both fraud prevention needs and system usability requirements to ensure that new tools would be effectively implemented by VA staff and other users. Innovation projects had explored emerging technologies that could enhance fraud prevention capabilities while protecting veteran privacy and maintaining system efficiency. Artificial intelligence applications, blockchain security protocols, and advanced data analytics had shown promise for detecting fraud patterns while reducing administrative burdens on legitimate benefit processing. Research initiatives had included collaboration with academic institutions, studying veteran benefit fraud patterns, prevention strategy effectiveness, and victim recovery processes. The research work required understanding social science methodology while contributing practical insights gained through advocacy experience. Published research findings had influenced policy developments and professional practice in fraud prevention and victim services. Policy analysis activities had included reviewing proposed legislation, regulatory changes, and administrative procedures for their potential impact on fraud prevention and veteran services. The policy analysis required understanding legal frameworks, implementation challenges, and stakeholder interests while providing recommendations that balanced multiple competing priorities. Legislative testimony had become a regular responsibility as congressional committees sought expert perspectives on veteran benefit fraud and prevention strategies.
Testifying required preparation and communication skills while managing the political dynamics that influenced legislative decision-making. The testimony often provided crucial information that shaped congressional understanding of fraud prevention challenges and funding needs. Regulatory development had included participation in federal rulemaking processes that established new fraud prevention requirements and procedures. The regulatory work required technical expertise and stakeholder engagement skills while navigating complex administrative procedures that governed federal agency operations. The depth of institutional change that had emerged from Jessica's crimes and my subsequent advocacy work exceeded anything I could have imagined during those first dark months after discovering her theft. Individual trauma had been transformed into systemic protection for thousands of veterans who would never know they'd been protected from potential exploitation by family members or institutional insiders. The legislative changes, technological improvements, and training programs that emerged from my advocacy work represented permanent institutional knowledge that would continue protecting veterans long after my direct involvement ended. Standing at that podium in Washington, D.C., preparing to launch a nationwide fraud prevention initiative, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had once sat in a studio apartment, counting pills and questioning her own perceptions, had become a national expert whose recommendations influenced federal policy and protected vulnerable veterans from exploitation. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but had developed through years of consistent effort, professional development, and commitment to channeling personal trauma into constructive change. Jessica's release from prison and our careful reconciliation process represented another chapter in a story that would continue evolving for years to come. Forgiveness remained a work in progress, built on demonstrated accountability rather than emotional reconciliation. Trust would require ongoing verification through actions rather than words. The relationship we rebuilt would be different from what we'd shared before her crimes, informed by hard-earned knowledge about how trust could be violated and systematically rebuilt through transparency and mutual respect. The audience in that Washington, D.C. conference hall represented thousands of individuals working to serve veterans through government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and advocacy groups. Their commitment to preventing fraud and supporting veteran recovery provided hope that the systemic changes we'd implemented would continue improving and expanding. The work was far from complete, but the foundation had been established for ongoing progress in protecting veterans from exploitation while ensuring access to the benefits they'd earned through military service. My presentation concluded with a call to action that emphasized individual responsibility and collective commitment to protecting the veteran community from those who would exploit their trust and vulnerability. Fraud prevention required ongoing vigilance from everyone involved in veteran services, from federal administrators to family members who might observe concerning behavior. The institutional changes we'd implemented provided tools and resources, but human judgment and moral courage remained essential for detecting and preventing exploitation. The applause that followed felt like recognition not just for my advocacy work, but for every veteran who had survived family betrayal, institutional failure, and financial exploitation while maintaining commitment to serving others. The room full of advocates and administrators represented a community that understood the importance of protecting those who had already sacrificed for their country's security. Their continued work would ensure that the lessons learned from Jessica's crimes would protect future generations of veterans from similar exploitation. As I stepped down from the podium, Agent Chen approached with updates about additional fraud cases that had been detected through the monitoring systems we'd helped develop. 3 families in different states had been investigated for benefit theft, with 2 cases resulting in criminal charges and full restitution for the victim veterans. The technological tools and training programs were working as designed, identifying suspicious activity before it could cause extensive financial or emotional damage. The ongoing work would continue expanding as more VA facilities implement fraud prevention protocols and more staff received training in recognizing manipulation tactics. Victim services would be enhanced to provide better support for veterans recovering from family betrayal and financial exploitation. Legislative initiatives would strengthen penalties for benefit fraud while protecting legitimate claimants from unnecessary scrutiny or bureaucratic obstacles. My role would continue evolving as institutional systems matured and new challenges emerged in the fraud prevention landscape. The expertise I'd gained through personal experience and professional development would remain valuable for training staff, consulting on complex cases, and advocating for policy improvements that balanced security with accessibility. The work had become more than a career. It was a mission that connected my military service to ongoing service for the veteran community. The healing journey would continue as well, with therapy, support groups, and family counseling providing tools for processing the complex emotions that accompanied advocacy work and family reconciliation. Professional success and public recognition didn't eliminate the need for emotional self-care and relationship maintenance. The trauma of betrayal and the stress of public advocacy required ongoing attention to mental health and personal well-being. Financial security had been achieved through careful investment of restitution funds, speaking fees, consulting income, and book royalties that provided independence and flexibility for continued advocacy work. The motorcycle restoration business had grown into a small enterprise that generated additional income while providing therapeutic benefits and social connections within the veteran community.
Economic stability had created space for choosing advocacy opportunities based on their potential impact rather than immediate financial needs. Community relationships had deepened through shared work on veteran issues and common interests in motorcycle restoration and outdoor activities. The social isolation that had characterized my early recovery had been replaced by rich networks of professional colleagues, advocacy partners, and personal friends who shared various aspects of my post-military life. These relationships provided support, accountability, and joy that balanced the intensity of fraud prevention work. Future planning included expanding advocacy work to address other forms of veteran exploitation, developing additional training programs for institutions serving military families, and continuing research into fraud prevention strategies. Book projects would share lessons learned through personal experience while providing practical guidance for other fraud victims and their families. Speaking engagements would continue raising awareness about veteran protection issues while building support for legislative and institutional reforms. The legacy of Jessica's crimes had been transformed from personal devastation into institutional protection that would benefit countless veterans for generations to come. Individual suffering had been channeled into collective healing that strengthened the entire veteran support system. The fraudulent schemes that had once threatened my financial security had become the foundation for nationwide prevention programs that would protect vulnerable veterans from similar exploitation. As I left the conference center and walked through the streets of Washington, D.C., passing monuments to military sacrifice and government buildings where policy decisions shape veteran services, I felt connected to something larger than personal recovery or professional success. The work represented continuation of military service in civilian contexts, protecting fellow veterans from those who would exploit their trust and vulnerability. The mission had evolved but remained fundamentally the same: service to others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.